Yeah. So we have pretty much gone into the subject quite deeply, and um, so let us. It is basically recap. I mean, there is absolutely no need for me to go through these slides again because you have seen better than these slides, and you may find that these. I mean, but you may find them somewhat interesting. So I thought let me go through it one more time. So it is always good to repeat something. So metals, we know that we have, we are thinking about free electrons, and then free electrons actually they are split into strongly into absorption. So if you have metal films, then your K is going to be non-zero. Okay, please be ready for that, and N is going to be very high. Just examples are, and you might be wondering why the chromium example is there. I feel that chromium is actually, I think some of you know because you are from thin film community. So chromium is actually a very famous material for one reason. Chromium actually is used. Uh, I think some of you may know that this is suppose this is silicon and this is silicon oxide. So chromium is actually used as a wetting layer, under layer, before putting gold actually. So this is, for example, gold. So this is actually before putting gold on silicon oxide, it is better to put chromium or vanadium. What is the reason? Because gold does not uh, uh, basically wet silicon oxide. So wettability of gold on silicon is not good actually. Okay. So yes, anybody? Anyway, so that is so if you directly coat gold over silicon oxide, so and you make some devices, so it is likely that this gold layer will peel off over a period of time. It may not peel off immediately, but suppose you are doing some processing, you are dipping it in some mild solvent, so you may see that there will be some cracks, and you may not see it by eyes, but there will be some micro cracks and voids and stuff like that. So it is always recommended that you wet it by chromium or vanadium, and then you coat gold over that. So probably this is the reason chromium is there, and maybe for some other industrial uses. So I'm trying to find actually what is. So one thing you can immediately note that for chromium, K is non-zero. I mean, it is non-zero in entire uh, range from 200 to whatever 1200 range which is plotted. So and K, if you sorry, N is very high actually. N if you see, N is basically this red curve, and it goes to around 4.5, which is very high actually. I think all of you are aware of this. This N 4.5 is quite high. In comparison to that, glass uh, refractive index is around 1.7 or something like that. Okay, which is a dielectric. This is very high actually, and this is another example that if you put 100 angstrom nickel on silicon oxide, then this is going to be the transmission, and you can see that transmission is not very high. That means it absorbs quite strongly, and you can see that transmission goes down actually at at these regions. And yeah, so let's see what is next. So dielectrics concept, you can basically you can see some of the dielectric materials, and here you will immediately notice that K, you can see that this is K for tantalum oxide and niobium oxide, and then you can see that K, which is actually the green curve, green solid curve, and green dotted curve. And what you can see here is that, let me move it away. Yeah. So what you can see here that Ka becomes zero. So this film becomes transparent beyond this region. Then it shoots up. You can see that these film starts absorbing around somewhere here, right? And and if you notice, n is n remains much lower than what we found for chromium metal. And similarly, you can see that these are actually high index film. Okay, tantalum oxide and niobium oxide. And I think all of you know that what makes film high index films, it is basically polarizability of atoms. I think you please remember this polarizability of atoms and the density, actually how densely they, what is the density of the material, and combined effect is basically optical density. And now you can see that low index films are uh, you know uh, uh, okay, magnesium fluoride and silicon oxide and alumina. And this I think this dispersion was discussed by Monica Ghalawat in the first session, and it changes with lambda. I think you can see that. And I think Anjana, right? Anjana Nair madam asked this question that about, so Kaushi Urbach you can apply. I think some student might have discussed, but they are not trained by me because there was no time actually. They are self-trained actually. So, and within probably they have 15 days training actually, not more than that on ellipsometer. So, yeah. So waves move slower. We have discussed already. So it's all repetition actually. So, but so far, so basically, so higher the refractive index, slower the. But what is the reason? What is the physics behind that? It's the same thing because we have discussed yesterday. You can draw all the conclusions. This is all manifestation of what we discussed yesterday. That more the interaction and there is an oscillation of electron cloud. So more the oscillations than strongly than if the atom is polarizable. So you can sway the you can swing the electron like a swing in the park, right? You have the swing in the park. It can move uh, this side and this side. So then it basically slows down the wave. So if you're, but the frequency remains the same. Please note that frequency is not changing. So what else needs to it is compensated by lambda. So lambda goes down as velocity goes down in order, so frequency remains the same, right? So wavelength also goes down actually, and then when it exits, so you can basically think wave like this. So this is some lambda. So if it slows down, so lambda get reduced in a high index material. So when it exits, so then it regains the lambda. This is basically your slab of your material. So there actually wave get modified. Yeah, it is written here that oscillating electron around nucleus, charged cloud, which basically um, is responsible for slowing it down. Now, this pictorial, this description is mentioned here. So, and it is easy for electron to move around, and nucleus, like a fat boy, does not wants to move around. So it stays in the place. Okay. So electrons are light particles, and so it moves easily, and it can move in even if you take from X-rays and upwards in the wavelength. X-ray is also same case, in that's why X-rays are not sensitive. Please note that this is statement, very important statement. I think I might have given this statement earlier also, but I'm repeating. So X-rays are insensitive to the presence of nucleus. Okay, X-rays are that's why X-ray basically sends the electron cloud again. X-rays, they see nucleus remains stationary when the X-rays interact. Nucleus behaves as if that like blindfolded, that I don't know you. I mean I don't want to see you because I have to move fast. So see, nucleus is lazy boy, and electrons are basically fast moving students. Yeah. So electric field of light wave causes oscillations in the electron cloud, and So atoms borrow energy from the electric field and then give it back. So there is a re-radiation. Okay, what we discussed yesterday, it's all dipolar re-radiation. There is nothing which is held back. So this condition applies when P is equal to 0. So there is nothing is capped by these oscillating dipole. They don't want to keep any energy. They take it and they oscillate and they give it back. Obviously, they will give it back in all the directions. You might have seen. And suppose this is one oscillating dipole. Suppose I will write here. Suppose this is one oscillating dipole. Okay, it's re-radiating. There is another one here, another atom. So they are radiating in all directions. So collectively, then what you see, reflection and refraction, is basically interference between these oscillating dipoles, which are there in your material. So let us move ahead. Oscillation take time, and that's the reason. And that's the reason that the waves are out of phase. So the delay, there is a lag actually. There is actually always a lag. So I think students have already explained you. So what you see actually, for example, you have the S wave and P wave when they interact with your material. So outgoing wave will not be in the same phase. Obviously, it will change in the intensity. What intensity is basically whatever amplitude square, amplitude or whatever, and they will also shift in the phase. Okay, so there will be change in the amplitude as well as, and this is because that they don't want to follow the same phase. They will take their own time actually. So that then they are out of phase. Out of phase does not mean that they are not incoherent. See, incoherency is completely different. Incoherency means there is no phase information. I mean, if you cannot relate these two waves, then that means they are incoherent. So they are still coherent. But so if this wave is coming and this another wave, you are able to relate. This peak is here, and so then you can compare actually. By a very favorite instrument of physicists, I think I think it is there in the ellipsometer also inside the control panel. I mean, inside the electronics. You know that it is called lock-in amplifier. Some physics people might have used it. It's one of my favorite instrument from my PhD time. You can use it in everywhere. Even in atomic force microscope, scattering tunneling microscope, all these wherever you need phase detection, this does a brilliant job. In AFM, there are actually 2-3 of lock-in amplifiers, and without lock-in amplifier, you can't think of comparing. So, for example, the task I'm a little bit discussing electronics here. So, because I thought I'll give you some electronics flavor, electronics industry. So, electronic engineering. So, when you want to, how do you compare this wave with this wave? Basically, you do it by feeding both the waves. One is this as a reference and signal with this one. So, and then lock-in amplifier will lock the particular frequency and then compare both the waves. And here, this is a reference wave. It's fine. I mean, that's how you can feed 2-3 signals and compare them. So analogy is basically like you are okay. What is the nearest beach close to you, Anjana? Anjana?
Yes, sir.
What is the nearest beach close to your house? Nearest ocean?
Alapura beach.
Okay, Malappuram. So basically,
my house is.
Okay, whatever. I wanted to.
Sir, my house. Okay.
Yeah. I wanted to just take a humor break actually. So for example, Anjana walks close to the sea, and when she starts going towards the sand, her velocity will slow down because sand will slow her down. So it's exactly like that. And if she further walks into the water plus sand, so she will change, she will slow down. So it is exactly like that actually. The wave slows down in the inside the yeah. So another analogy is basically like you can harmonic oscillator or spring, mass on the spring. There are many analogies actually. You can relate this to mass which is tied to a spring, and the same model is basically used to explain the polarizability, right? I think you know about that. I mean, when you discuss polarizability or something, you all take the same model. Harmonic oscillator or damped harmonic oscillator, coupled, it get coupled also. You know, a lot of these oscillators will get coupled actually. Suppose one atom is here, another atom is here, another. So many at specific frequency, this oscillator may get coupled. So there may be coupling actually, and there will be resonance. Okay, so it's fascinating actually. So so resonance is when there is a maximum energy transfer, and you can see this is the resonance peak. I mean, this is specifically for the case of dielectrics. In dielectrics, actually, you see the resonance peak, and you might have used the quartz thing, thickness monitor in deposition system. Some people might have this um, quartz base. So if there is a quartz crystal on in all the deposition chambers, even chemistry students, they use this thickness. I forgot the name of the instrument. It's very cheap actually. It was there in my lab also. Anyway, so there actually what happens is that you take a quartz crystal and it has some resonance frequency f0, right? So it oscillates uh, uh, strongly at that frequency, and then when you deposit some extra mass, suppose you are having a deposition chamber, so you have a substrate here, and you're depositing some matter, and then you put this side by side this crystal, uh, so it will change its resonance frequency when which will be proportional to the mass transfer. So that's how, if you can calibrate this change in the uh, resonance frequency as a function of mass transfer, so that you can calculate how much mass is transferred. Obviously, this will be different for different material depending upon the density of the material. But that's just an offshoot of what I was. So this is also dielectric resonance, and so this is displayed in the Lipsometer also. You can see that there are three regions, below and above, and here you can see the peak in uh, uh, this extinction coefficient k, and k sharply goes up from 0, and so this is actually transparent region, and then you go to a strongly absorbing region, and so energy is transferred, and then it goes back to the 0. So that means that's one of the resonance frequency. You can have basically multiple resonance frequencies. You can have basically harmonics also of that. You know that 2f and other things. So you may see actually harmonics of that of those things. So below the resonance, actually you are approaching the resonance frequency. The charge cloud amplitude start increasing. So this the basically the velocity of this swing start increasing, and then it goes. I mean, just imagine yourself sitting on this swing, and just you close your eyes and you just do a thought experiment, and then how do you start actually at a particular uh, uh, you know at particular frequency, your amplitude is high. You go really very high, and then you come back, and then I mean you say that okay, so that's the highest amplitude. Okay, so energy is more efficiently coupled to the oscillator, right? And so it's basically energy is added to each cycle and swings higher and higher. So you can see that it is going up. Okay, but so basically it goes towards larger amplitude and longer delay in the remitted. So there is a phase lag, increasing phase lag. Okay. So longer delay means phase lag basically means higher index. That not necessarily that you have pay non-zero, but n is basically higher and higher. Okay, n is non-zero. Okay, But below, okay, then at resonance, then you have this peak in K, and then K is non-zero. And here, as I mentioned, that these electron cloud will behave as a collective. So, for example, you have many swings actually. Okay, I think you might have seen coupled harmonic oscillators. So there are basically millions and millions of these oscillators which are basically coupling, and then there is a collectiveness here, and then they all get together, and then they show this resonance actually. Of course, for a crystal, it will have different frequencies. If it is anisotropic material in different directions, this will be different. Obviously, those complexity will be there in your material. So, but I'm giving you the broad overview, what is commonly seen. And then finally, above the resonance, because you have crossed the resonance, and obviously this absorption will go down to back to zero. Here you have zero, and then you will see probably when you stretch it back, then you will again see absorption, right? So that's how it works actually, right? So absorption is basically loss of oscillator energy. So this energy loss, basically, where does it go? It basically goes into the heat. So you are basically heating the material. So that's the reason I mentioned that glass is transparent, invisible, and then it starts absorbing in UV and then in IR. But the mechanism of absorption, the physics behind the absorption is different in IR and different in UV and below. Okay, so please keep it in mind. The mechanism is different actually. Different parts of there is a dipolar role, and then there is electron cloud role. There are two different actually. Okay, I think people who are working in the dielectrics, they know it actually. And there is a different dielectric science. I mean, my lecture in another conference in first half was for that only. Yeah, so there is something called Kramer, and they are not independent actually. They are coupled through the Kramer-Kronig relation, and it's called KK consistency. So this N and K, they are actually like cause and effect. They are related actually. They're related through the Kramer. So it's called KK consistency. So it is always good to check the when you are doing actually this point by point fitting, which students were showing you yesterday. It is better to check whether they are KK consistent or not. Finally, semiconductors. Semiconductors, basically we apply band theory and okay, Felix Bloch was a physicist who gave this band theory. So basically, when you keep on bringing atoms together, and then there is a sharing of the electron and hybridization of the label. Finally, you have discrete. Initially, you have a discreteness, and then you start forming these bands when you have a large number of atoms, and then you have the band gap. And physicists they know that it is, when we look at the band picture, it is highly inaccurate picture. It's basically a fake picture actually. I think all of you know, but most of the time we look at this EK diagram as proportional to K square, which is not a correct picture. Correct picture is somewhat more complex, but we look at the zone, Bourlet zone center, and we look at the band gap here. I think you're aware of graphene. Graphene, there is a big gap at the zone center, and zone boundaries only you have this Dirac cone, right? Where there's a zero band gap semiconductor connector. When we look at the EK diagram of graphene, we find that there is actually a gap in the center, zone center, but the zero gap is only at the zone boundaries, right? For single layer graphene. So similarly, and this has got directionalities also. So band gap, when we say band gap, so it is not a simple picture like that electron jumps from here to here and stuff like that. And and it is also for an isotropic material. This band gap will be very different in very different directions. Also, this band, electronic diagram, band diagram will be very different actually. So, so it is quite complex as what we picturize. Sometimes we picturize it just by two lines actually. This is a conduction band, this is a valence band, and then electron is jumping from here to here. So these complexities are seen fortunately in the ellipsometry measurements. So you can in fact see these complexities in. So you can look at the band gap picture by using this Cauchy-Urbach model. And I have done a lot of fitting for semiconductors, and I have calculated band gaps and other things. But probably we'll keep it reserved for advanced workshop. We'll decide the date soon, and under this, and you will get the certificate also. So we'll have part 2 of this workshop, and I will talk to my colleagues. Probably we'll keep it under the same umbrella, NCL SDP. So you get certificate from Government of India. Okay. So please send me your names if you are interested in the second part. I wanted to keep the fee 0 or 100 rupees, but there is some requirement from government, so we had to keep 500 rupees. So it goes to NCL. Okay. So yeah, I told my colleagues that I don't want to charge even a single. I hope that all of you will get reimbursement from your institutes. Guys, anybody who will not get the reimbursement from your Asim, you will not get definitely.
I'm not likely to get reimbursement, but that's okay. I mean, I don't look at it as expenditure. I look this as an investment in myself.
Investment, yeah. It is Asim. It is not just your investment. It is investment for. It is a fixed deposit for me also. If I'm spending my time on all of you, so believe me, it is it is my fixed deposit also, because
Yes, for you, you will gain some good students upon which you can rely for future collaboration as well. I look to that as as probable outcome.
yeah, that is also true, but not like that. But I mean, it's an investment for the country actually. I would say that wherever and not like a personal gain, like to get a student or collaborator, but for country actually. That's
Everyone, not individuals, but we
not
as
yeah,
a
yeah.
scientist community we gain.
That community, yes, you're right. So anyway, some students come from poor economic backgrounds. So let me know if you have any issue with the funds. We'll do something. Yeah. So yeah. So the critical points are basically where they're sharp. I will leave you one thought actually, one exercise which I was trying to decode several years back. What is the relation between? I think some people may know, and it's a very brilliant physics question. What is the relation between refractive index and the band gap in semiconductors? So there is something called, it is out of the syllabus. I mean, for ellipsometry training, but I like to go beyond syllabus. So there is something called Mohs law. So it was given by a British physicist, not that far. I think 1950s. I think Professor T.S. Mohs. So it is not much investigated actually. Somehow it is not. No, not many people actually know about it. Believe me, when I talk to people mostly, and it's basically empirical law. There is no basically people are obsessed with the band gap engineering, right? We are always obsessed in semiconductor physics or semiconductor chemistry, whatever you call it, or semiconductor engineering. We are always obsessed by tuning the band gap. I think many of you are working or will work on semiconductors, right? Whether it is photocatalyst or whatever energy device, all kinds of solar, uh, uh, photovoltaics or whatnot. So, but hardly people pay attention for effect of n as a function of particle size. So how the refractive index changes as a function of particle size there is not much focus. Obviously, it's not very easy. Refractive index, as you know, that it's not very easy to calculate. Now that's the reason we are here. But band gap you can easily measure using there is something called optical band gap and there is something called electronic band gap. Electronic band gap is more for purist like physicists. So they use, for example, STM or direct electronic conduction to look at the band gap. An optical gap is a bit a pseudo gap. I mean, using optical techniques, it's very difficult to get the true picture of the band gap. So best way is basically to do scanning tunneling microscopy, which I teach a lot at NCL. So coming back to the Mohs law, so Mohs told that n to the power 4 times Eg is constant actually. Please look at this Mohs law. I mean, if any of you are interested. So there is no physical basis actually for that. I was trying to see what is there any physics behind that, because these two things are not directly coupled. When I say physics, because n is basically, you know, that it is coupled with the polarizability of the atom, how you can move the atoms, okay, and this is basically Eg is basically related to your band picture actually, where n is not necessarily, I mean, n will get affected, but not that directly actually. So when you are talking about solar energy and solar devices, n is equally, people somehow get obsessed with Eg, and I spoke to many of my colleagues who are neck deep in the solar photovoltaic, that you are ignoring actually n, and n will have consequences. How many people, I don't know of you work with solar photovoltaic devices, for example, for solar energy. So when the photon actually is coming and you have this solar cell, so finally its absorption and reflection and transmission is the function of the, basically that's what we are studying. So photon, what is the guarantee that your photon will enter into the medium and it will interact, not just enter, but it will get absorbed. So this is basically that. So your N1 and N2 it directly affects this actually. So Eg will come in later into the picture. Okay, first basically that electron should, this photon should enter actually, should not reflect back actually. So what I'm trying to tell you is that n is equally important for any optical devices, be it solar cells, but most of the focus somehow remains around band gaps, which is unfair, I believe. So anyway, this is my rant. I was actually, it was my rant of the day actually. Okay. So this is another application that, as I mentioned, that this band gap is highly related to the crystalline nature of the material, and so this is reflected by amorphous versus crystalline. It's a brilliant example that you can see that these critical points are missing here. If you see dotted curve is for amorphous silicon, and this is the wavelength, and this is the refractive index, and you can see this critical points in the crystalline silicon. Of course you should see, but you see here amorphous silicon show completely behavior. It is basically 100%, I mean almost 100% amorphous. But if it is, what is the fate? And you can see the consequences in K also, and which is the curve for amorphous is quite, you can see that's quite smooth actually, without any features as you see it here. So what is something in between? So this is very brilliant actually for solar photovoltaic industry, right? So you can see that how the K varies with the amorphicity. So this is completely amorphous wafer, and you can see this red curve, which is very smooth. And then increasingly you introduce the crystallinity, and it is highly sensitive to the crystallinity, and you can actually calculate. We have asked sample actually for that. I don't know whether it was demonstrated, but it was, we had planned this actually, but to demonstrate this in the lab, but we did not get actually because of this lockdown problems. Many of the laboratories are closed. We don't have this sample in our lab, so we asked some ISER friends. So I'm not sure whether we received the sample. So he was also he said that his laboratories was locked, and he actually came to his lab. He stays outside the campus. So he wrote me email that he will try to help us, but I'm not sure. We'll keep it in the second round. Don't worry about that. All these things will be discussed, and we'll request the users also to send us the samples which they can provide. So we'll test them here. And finally is the infrared absorption, which all of you are familiar. So I'll skip it because you are from chemistry community. So this is very, very simple and it has been discussed also. So it's all about, allo mode, longitudinal optical, this is for phonons, that you have this optical phonons and acoustics, and then this longitudinal mode and transverse mode. Actually, you can see all these things. So finally, one more thing which most people most of you know, but people who do not know that N and K, they are interrelated to the complex dielectric function. So I think it's already covered, but you can calculate back and forth. So if you know N and K, you can calculate real and imaginary part of the permittivity, and if you know the permittivity, you can calculate. So it is, but it is different than the permittivity which is calculated through the electrical measurements, and this is actually called pseudo dielectric constant. It is not the same one actually, because of the role of substrate, because you have some material on top of a substrate. So so that's why, like pseudo Brewster angle, so it is considered as pseudo, but it is very helpful actually. So this is the relation, and now once you have N and K, you can directly calculate this. And I will not go into the equation, but because it's very simple, you can take just the square of it and then solve these equations. That will give you N and K. If you have epsilon 1 and epsilon 2, you can calculate that. And I think students showed you that you can decide what will be your y-axis, and software automatically does these conversions, so you don't need to worry about that. So finally, we have covered these 4 different classes of materials. And yeah, so dispersion of light, I think Shefali asked these questions. So that physical basis, so I promise that I will cover it. So it was given in 1836 by Augustin Cauchy, and it's an empirical relation. So there is no physical basis. It's just the relation which I think you all you know that it is for strictly for k is equal to 0, and this empirical relation has got a lot of limitations actually, and there is no physical basis. So this is just some fit actually, just a curve fit. But it helps, because in quality control, in industry, it really helps a lot, because you can immediately. Any question? Yeah. Yeah. So you can see actually any deviation. Pooja, I can't hear you. There is some noise. Pooja, there is some noise in your voice. Just check your audio. Oh, what's going on? Okay, so you can see that there is a subtle change from BK7 to fused silica, and different kinds of glasses. So fused silica is actually a very useful substrate which I used to use quite often, and I have not used other kind of glasses. BK7 is of course very popular, and I have used only these two glasses. I have not used these other glasses. So there is another model which is so there are problems with the Cauchy dispersion model, and you can see the problem here in BK7 class itself. You can see that even though it is empirical, so it does not, it start deviating here and beyond. Actually, you can see that Selmayr model fits quite well. Pooja. Yeah. So you can see that. To answer Shefali's question again, so basically, if you have, you can interpolate actually. Suppose all these reasons fit your fit this law. So you can actually, if you are looking at some intermediate points, suppose you are looking at some data at some intermediate wavelength, so you know that it fits, so you can easily calculate actually. And I think there is no other. Also, you can you don't need to know the second application for Pooja. Somebody can call her and Dubai, you have a list of participants and this Excel file number.
Yes, sir.
Call Pooja, okay, and tell her that there is a problem with her mobile. You have her number, right, in the Excel file?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, please do that. So another application which I see, I think probably Monica Khalawat has shown you that if you do not have a model and you have non-absorbing film, so you don't need to really know the material. You can, for a non-absorbing material, you can fit these, n versus lambda, and that is enough actually. So instead of, for example, silicon oxide layer, you can, in fact, you can fit Cauchy model. Or Cauchy-Urbach, whatever. And there are many other, actually, I told you that about, sorry, Selmayr, actually, Selmayr model. I'm sorry. So this is the Selmayr dispersion equation. This is more complex. I just hate equations. I love physics, but I don't like actually. I'm first. I would like to forget these equations actually. Are intimidating actually to me. That's why I mean it's there and I have to teach, I have to show you this equation, otherwise I don't like it. Anyway, sorry for that. So Fresnel's equation, they are extremely boring, and please forget them. I don't want you to remember, and that they serve just specific purpose. After that you can just forget them, because there is no, I mean, you have to understand the basic physics rather than these lengthy equations, but they're useful, they serve some purpose. Beyond that, you can forget them. Okay, so let's move ahead. So I'll then now actually our ellipsometry session starts actually. Beyond that, it was just basics. So this is actually first slide of ellipsometry, but I think students have done pretty much good jobs. I can skip these slides now. So yes, this is just a boring slide, but I thought some people might be interested. There is no conceptual understanding which is required in these slides. I'm just skipping wherever there is no need for me to teach anything here. So you can see that these are industry. This is industry profile. It might have changed because it's old slide. This is already understood. Yeah, and somebody asked, I think yesterday, this question that can we do multiple layers? Yes, you can do. You can actually keep on. So this is your substrate, and as we debated yesterday, that substrate you do not need to know the thickness. You can put any substrate means light is not. So there was a lot of questions about the what do you mean by substrate. I have a slide actually on that. That what is the meaning of substrate? Not here. Anyway, I have actually a lot of discussion actually on this, but I can tell you the essence right now. substrate, what qualifies basically the substrate for ellipsometry? Substrate, any material where the beam does not reflect back from this interface qualifies for the substrate. I mean, it should not come back and contribute here. It's not allowed. But that's the substrate. And it should be, of course, it should be as flat as possible. So it should be as flat as possible. It should be known material. You should know the substrate. I mean, when I say know the substrate, you should know at least what is the substrate is made of, so you can put it in the fit parameter. Thickness does not matter. Only fact which contributes to thickness, it should be thick enough that electromagnetic wave which is entering inside this material should not reflect back from this interface whenever it sees another medium. Okay, so you have to make sure that you do something. Either you make it rough, or you blacken this surface, or whatever you do, but make sure that it does not come back. And that answers that question of I think Ruchi or Mayank, I think. I forget her name. R se hai na name uska, student ka. Anyway, so
Hello, sir.
Yes, ma'am.
Sir, so substrate should be having very low polarizability like this. Do you mean this?
No, I mean this, that substrate should be thick enough, not about polarizability. It should be thick enough that it absorbs all the radiation which is entering and nothing is reflected back. It should be thick enough. Okay, so because
Okay, sir.
Absorption, you know the Beer-Lambert law, right? It is related to thickness also of the medium.
Yes, sir. Path length. Yes, sir.
Yeah, path length. So path length should be sufficient enough. And if, for example, you have a glass substrate which has A is equal to 0 for some of the wavelength range, okay. So for that you need to do something to blacken it, I think. Okay, so that's a common question which we get all the time. But you can measure always multiple films actually. An example is this. Okay, so I think this slide answers multiple questions actually which were asked in last 2 days, and let us spend a lot of time into that actually. So what you see here is this is taken from Fujiwara's book, which I consider as one of the best books. There are other by Tompkins, Professor Tompkins, and by Palik et al. I have many books actually. I have given to some books to my students also. But Fujiwara's book is a standard book. It's a bit boring because it is translated, as I said. Fujiwara is a Japanese professor, and he wrote it in Japanese. So English is, I find, I mean, it's my personal opinion. Your opinion may be different about English. But I find English a bit not very tasty, palatable. Some tasty, some immediately its readability is a little bit compromised, but it's okay. It's my personal. Anyway, so you can see that this scale is 0.1 micron, and this is the penetration depth of the light. And you can see that this is the results which we get from TEM, and TEM is basically direct technique, but it is not non-destructive because you need to do lot of you have to cut the sample, actually cut the wafer, and in order to reveal those layers. And now you can see the bottom layer is crystalline silicon. Let's first look at what TM tells us. So TM tells us that okay, bottom layer is your crystalline silicon, fine, and on top of that you have amorphous silicon somewhere here, and which as per TM is 250 plus minus 5 nanometer, and on top of that you have another crystalline film crystalline silicon, which is this thickness, and again plus minus this, and then you have a mix of crystalline, and then finally you have silicon oxide. So I think this answers many questions actually. Which first question is that how many layers you can do, what should be the collective thicknesses, and all kinds of questions are answered here. Now let us see what spectroscopic ellipsometry tells us about the same sample. So now you see, let me yeah. So you can see now here that TM tells us that this is amorphous. How does it tell you that this is amorphous? You have to sit into my electron microscopy course, which is actually running these days. I'm teaching to PhD students. It's highly popular course since 1 decade. So there I teach actually how you can, I think, but many people may know already because TM is a very popular technique. But how you distinguish between crystalline and amorphous, you can do it fairly easily. But that's not the focus. So you can see that spectroscopic ellipsometry goes a step ahead. It tells you the ratio of crystalline versus amorphous. Not only that, you see the modification into the results. I think somebody asked that, do you get the same results? I said that this is more accurate. This is fairly accurate. You can see that this gives 270 plus minus 30 angstrom, and is closer to the reality. And again, you see, this tells you that this is crystalline, and it tells you, more accurate. It gives you better information. Actually, you can look at all the numbers. Here also, it tells you that it is crystalline plus amorphous, but it tells you the ratio actually, and then this is more accurate information. Similarly for top layer silicon oxide. So I think this answers many of your questions, I believe. Any further discussion on this point? Deepali, I have not heard your voice, Deepali, so far. Are you human?
Hello, sir.
Okay.
Sir, I have a doubt.
Yes, Pooja.
Which in the demo lecture also I asked Monica ma'am. Someone asked that the data that we get from TEM and that the data we get from ellipsometry, they differ. They don't give the accurate thickness. So
Yes,
my
they should
question
differ.
was, so there is an error in the measurement. So my question is whether this error is constant for any type of sample, or does this error differ from sample to sample? And so if it is same, suppose, so can we just do something, some calculation, and then come to a point like we get accurate thickness of the particular sample? I hope you got my question.
Okay, I got your question. Then suppose you are not a PhD student of NCL, but I teach a course which is there in NCL 101, I guess, and I spend almost 1.5 hours explaining this. What do you mean by error analysis? So there are two types of errors. I think you know. One is systematic
Yes, sir.
error. I think you are from analytic chemistry, so you know it, right?
Yes, sir.
Another is
Yes, sir.
random error, right? Random
Yes,
error.
sir. Yes, sir.
So many of these things which comes under systematic error, for example, TM has got a bunch of systematic error. For example, uncertainty plus minus contribution will be there from the way you do the measurements. Once the image is taken, you can still introduce errors in the on the computer screen when you. I mean, see, it's my personal opinion. In this case, forget about TEM, machine, etc. But let us keep the machine same and its own problem, its own accuracy and its own precision, all kinds of things. But if I ask you guys this question, that from TEM, how will you know that one layer ends and another layer starts? This decision who takes in TEM images. How do you take this decision? In SE, in space is taken by tight beam. You don't take this decision. In ellipsometer, this decision cannot be taken by you because thickness is actually modeled by basis on the how light interacts with various films, all these films. But in TEM, this question about interfacial interface, where this one layer ends, it's very controversial actually. Now this controversy is not there when you have this aberration corrected TEM. I'm not talking about latest, this highly expensive aberration, zero aberration TEMs. There actually you get a bright actually view of interfaces. You can get very high resolution, almost half of an angstrom. Okay, that's the latest resolution which we have reached in TEM. But this old-fashioned TEM, see, there is already a lot of error. How do you know that? So this is based on basically mostly the contrast actually. Contrast difference. If there is a contrast change. Okay, यहाँ line खींच दो. You draw the line here. You draw the line here. That's where this problem starts actually. Pooja, you understand? And this decision will be subjective to Pooja and me. I may say that no, this line I will draw it here. You can see how students, they do their analysis. They draw the lines actually around the particle size. For example, particle size measurement, most of the students, they do the manually and they draw the cursor somewhere and then they, I mean, some people say I will draw the cursor like this. I'm interested in this. Some people, so there is it's basically person to person variation also, which is missing actually in ellipsometry. Ellipsometry is model based and there is no human, the scope of human error is not there actually, which is my personal opinion. Here, the scope of human error is quite a lot actually. You understand what I mean?
Yes.
Huh?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Yeah. So that is the main problem. I can keep on talking on this issue because electron microscopy, I'm considered as an expert also. I've been teaching since last almost 15 years. So, but I don't want to go into the complexity, and this is what I believe, that there is a lot of human error in the TEM analysis. I don't know whether somebody has done, Anchal, you have done TEM. What is your opinion? Ram Prakash, Shefali. Shefali has attended my classes of TEM. Shefali?
Yes, sir.
What is your opinion about TEM, Shefali?
Yes, sir. There's a lot of human error even in HRTM images even.
In HRTM also there is a lot of human error. So we will come to the other instrument error later on. Let us first worry about the human errors, right?
Yes, sir. Yes.
And you might have seen in last 2-3 days that the scope of human error in ellipsometry is not there because it's a light interaction with the material. I mean, you don't decide actually that I want to keep the, okay. You will not get the fit actually if you do some so mess up actually. So
Yes,
that's my answer actually. But brilliant question by Pooja. It started good discussion. Anybody else? Anand? Deepali, I would like to hear your voice.
Yes, sir.
Where are you from, Deepali?
I'm working as a PA in Nandir Ma'am's under
Where,
Nandir
sorry?
Ma'am. I'm working as a PA.
Oh, you are my student from this NCL 218 class, right?
Yes, sir. Actually,
Oh.
I thought our class is going on. That's why I'm joining.
Oh, no problem. Yeah. Deepali is actually an NCL student of my NCL 218 class because I had to cancel all my classes for this course. So because 5 o'clock is the time of my class. So she's, anybody else? Neha Sawant, madam.
Hello, sir.
Yes. Neha, madam, yes, please.
Yes, sir. I understood.
Any question?
Sir, hello.
Yes, Anand, yes, bolo.
Sir, if we record the thickness by AFM, can that thickness is reliable?
AFM has another problem actually. Okay, we are also AFM lab, my group. Yeah.
Actually, sir, I try for the
I will explain you.
recording.
I'll explain you the problem with the profilometer and the AFM. AFM is highly precise way of measuring the thickness, but AFM actually relies on uh, uh, actually your step size. For example, AFM for example, this is your film. AFM cannot see multi-layer. Number one, so AFM can never tell you this multi-layer thickness. So it sees, for example, you have these layers, multiple layers. So what it does basically, you have to have an exposed surface. If you don't have exposed surface, then you can't measure the thickness. So basically, AFM will look at the atomic forces somewhere here, and then it will raster scan the your AFM probe here, and then it will do the scan actually of surface. So you have to tell the instrument that this is my baseline, this is my substrate. So it should have an exposed uncoated area as a reference point, which you call as a substrate. Because how does AFM know that this is your substrate? Got it? So same thing is with the same problem is with the this profilometer. So anything, so it is not sensitive to your subsurface information. AFM is not sensitive to the subsurface information. So now somebody can ask that why AFM is so popular. AFM actually is popular because it gives you true three-dimensional picture of a terrain. Okay, for example, you are on Himalaya. It's basically you are flying in a plane and you are looking from a plane, the terrain of Himalaya. So you see the bumps and valleys and your eyes record the three-dimensional views, but you do not know whether underneath that peak there is some mineral inside that material, because AFM just look at the surface forces. Inside, if there is some other material, it does not see. In contrast, ellipsometry can go deeper inside, and depending upon K, of course, and the material properties, but it can look at several subsurface layer, and that's the reason that it can give you information about different layers, which AFM cannot do. Got my point?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Yeah. Any other discussion?
Yes,
Mayank?
sir. I have a doubt.
Yes, Aseem.
And that comes from that TEM versus AC comparison page. Could you go to that slide?
Yes, yes. Yes,
So,
let me erase it because I made it very dirty. So yeah.
Yeah. So the final error margins that we see, let's say on that last layer as well, these are substantially lower for ellipsometry, and which is a very good thing. But like if we are to understand how can we reduce them, let us say, are they dependent upon like number of layers that are existent or the wavelength of
This error margin is basically it comes from your confidence in your fitting actually.
Okay, so
it
it's a
reflects the confidence in the fitting if for ellipsometer.
Okay, so it's either it has to do either with the model that we are setting or with the settings on our equipment.
Settings of the equipment is standard. I mean, you have that has been told, because you have not, there is no setting actually. There is a set of angles and the wavelength. That's it. That's the only setting. But so it is model dependent actually, and it's pretty much model dependent actually. And for example, let me tell you that see, one thing you are missing in this model, which I find actually a big deficiency in this model. There is a problem in this model, which I would have corrected. I think my students and many of you now, that interfacial roughness It's not taken into account here. There is what is a guarantee that these layers are atomically smooth, and there is a sharp transition from, for example, from this layer to this layer. In material science, I don't see there is a sharp transition from, for example, crystalline silicon has exactly ended here, and this material has exactly started here. So there is always a interfacial layer. There is always a fusion actually between one layer to another layer, right? When one layer starts and another layer, so there is always a there is a basically Indian in China border, the no man's land. So everybody claims. So it's here that top layer also claims that this is my area, and this line silicon will say. So it's something like that exists when you deposit one layer on top of each.
Correct.
So that's where this error comes actually. There is something called gradation, like concentration gradation will be there. Second thing, so there are two sources. One is the gradation between two, like interpenetration of layers. Another is basically surface roughness. Even if there is no interpenetration, there is always you can call it actually it will result, surface roughness will also result into interpenetration, because suppose this layer is rough and I deposit some other material. So actually it is penetrating inside this layer. Actually, suppose I count this as a flat layer, but it is not flat.
Correct.
So this should have been modeled, and I believe that that's why I rate ellipsometry much higher than TEM, because had it been taken care of, this error should have been even less. And what is the reason that you find this error less? Because there is no layer, on top of that. You understand what I mean?
Right. So if there are two layers,
there are not two layers. There is only one interface here. So that's the reason that
then we could fit the model better.
Yes, exactly. So you can fit the model here better. So yeah. So then that's the reason that better you fit. I mean, they should have inserted SRF. I think students showed you SRF layer. So this is basically 50-50 ratio of this and this.
Okay.
Yeah, but brilliant question, brilliant discussion. Any other question? More questions? You are taking a piece of my brain if you involve me more and more in discussion.
Sir, I have a question.
Yes, ma'am. Suman, ma'am.
Sir, if you want to measure thickness of each and every layer, like we have deposited 3 layers on top of the substrate, then we have to do measurement after every deposition, or we can do it simultaneously?
Better is that you see, if you have access, if you can afford to do the measurement after each layer, it is better. The best is that you don't see. Let me tell you, there can be many answers to these questions, actually, depending upon what is the deposition instrument. If your layers are air sensitive, environment sensitive, that I would say that don't take panga and do the in situ ellipsometry and do the dynamic ellipsometry, for example. And when the layer is growing, then you are basically doing simultaneously, you are collecting the ellipsometry signal. So that is one thing. You are always taking a risk. So there is advantage and disadvantage if you deposit one layer and then do the ellipsometry and then deposit another layer, because as a purist, I am afraid of contamination actually a lot. So you may get true value of one layer, because the advantage of first approach that you deposit one layer and then measure is that you get your ellipsometry modeling becomes easy. Okay, it is very easy to do the ellipsometry modeling. It's basically one of the easiest way. You're making life of ellipsometry modeling easier, because you know this film is there, you have modeled it, its thickness and this thing. Once this is frozen, you can check out the fit parameter. So once you check it that I want to fit this, once you're done, you check out this is frozen in the model, you're not changing the model, then you deposit another layer, and this is already modeled, so this is not fitting, this is not a fit parameter, so you have less parameters to fit. So now you fit this, freeze this, deposit another material. So this is the best thing. But only problem which I see is that many times students in Indian condition, they end up contaminating this each layer. So you may have a piece of your hair or something on top of that, or fingerprint or something. If you care for that, this is the best approach, like step by step. Monica, does it answer your question? What is sorry, not Monica, somebody else.
Yes, sir.
Suman, yeah. Yeah. So as an ellipsometry person, it is better to do it step by step. Yeah. Anybody else?
Sir, may I ask a question?
Yes, Anchalji.
So, yeah, if we don't have the model of our material, then how to model it? And in order,
You can model it through this oscillator. You can apply this oscillator. There is something called Janos-Clair, general oscillator. So if the layer is, we'll teach it in the advanced workshop, that you can apply actually oscillators actually, because finally layer is basically they are actually oscillators, right, for electric field vector, right? Isn't it? Different kinds of oscillators, right? Different strength and everything. So instead of your actual material, you can assume that there are some oscillators which are oscillating and absorbing. I mean, they are interacting with the light. Okay. So that is one approach, but it rarely happens that you don't have the model available in the library for the films. Yeah, it rarely happens actually. Yeah. Anybody else?
Hello, sir.
Yes.
Hello.
Yes, Anjana. Yes, Anjana.
Sir, when we take a measurement of multi-layer films, is there any, I mean, does that affect the refractive index difference between the layers?
Between the layers. Can you repeat your question?
For multi-layer films,
yes.
Is there, I mean, the refractive index difference between the layers, if they are very close, does that,
okay, good
does
question.
the detect,
Good question. Very good, very excellent question. So, excellent question. I think this should have been asked much earlier, that how she's asking that suppose one layer number one, refractive index is 1.567, and layer number two is 1.7. Can ellipsometer distinguish? Actually, ellipsometer can, as far as I know, that it can look at the third decimal actually. Okay, changes. So that answers your question, that it's highly sensitive, so it can look at the subtle changes in the layers where there is not much difference. And one of the example is actually, that's why you can look at the doping actually. That's the reason you get these precise numbers actually. That's the reason that any subtle changes, you can see the subtle changes it can detect. So that is precisely because for example, these error bars. So there is a small change in the refractive index. When I say small, actually, what do you mean by small? Basically, the third decimal. I hope it answers your brilliant question, Anjana.
sir,
yes, sir, thank you.
Yes.
sir, apart from this apart from thickness and NK value, what are the other things we can extract from the obtained data?
Yes, I think there is a yes. That's your answer. That was basically next slide. This was actually next slide. So this is the answer. You can read it actually. It will give me some break. Let me get some water. Excuse me, sir. Yes.
So to this, I wanted to ask related to this question only. Can we have any idea about the morphology of the film from electrometry?
No, 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 not morphology, not at all, not at all, not at all, not at all. Morphology has to be very strict. That's a problem actually. You can do small angle X-ray scattering if you are interested in morphology. That is the best technique, or AFM or TEM. This is mostly for optical properties actually. I mean, and as well as thickness, but not if you have like complex granular structures or granular film. Those are actually also not recommended materials for electrometry because, yeah.
Sir, I'm talking about the substrate. Can we use metal zeolite composites?
Oh, I see. Okay, I think I did not understand. Okay, metal zeolite composites. Morphology of what? I mean, morphology is basically your shape and size.
No, sir, I'm not mixing the question. I got the answer of my first question about the morphology.
Oh, it's the second question. Okay, yes.
It's the second question. Talking about the substrate, actually, can we use metal zeolite composites as the substrate in electrometry?
Metal zeolite, zeolite. The problem is the porosity, right? It's
Yes,
a
sir.
porous substrate.
Yes, sir.
So there is something called, I will not disgrace you because, but I have to teach you. There is something called I teach actually. It is something called EMA theory, effective medium approximation. I think many people know about it. Sorry, effective medium approximation. So there are several models. One of the popular one is basically Maxwell Garnett. I think you are aware of that Maxwell Garnett model. There is a reverse Maxwell Garnett, and Maxwell Garnett was a mathematician in early 20th century, and his name is one person actually, and his father was a colleague of Maxwell, the physicist, who gave the classical those four equations of electrodynamics. So he decided then that when he in his family his son will be born, so he will name it after. So, and this guy did brilliant contribution. I consider him one of the brilliant scientists actually, Maxwell Garnett, because he then when there was no machine, there was no TEM or something, he actually calculated the refractive index for these glasses with colloidal gold, and in fact from that calculation he actually calculated the size of the this gold nanoparticles. But to answer your question, zeolites are actually porous materials. So modeling the substrate will be complicated because there is it's basically like air particles inside. So I have to model it by effective medium approximation, similar to Maxwell Garnett, that I have to consider the pores as air particles actually, which makes life more complex. But I will not say it is impossible, but it will make life miserable actually. Yeah, and
So then, one final question I have, like when we have thin films and we are working with thin, and I'm from a chemistry background actually, so I wanted to ask if we carry out catalysis on thin films, and while the reaction is going on, it is proceeding, can we take electrometry measurements, like how far the reaction have reached, or what is the what are the effects on the thin film catalysis?
Brilliant, Cyan, right? Those three questions are all top class. Actually, there are some new questions which you are asking me, which is actually give some freshness. So there is something called I will recommend you because I am also teacher of TM. There is something called in my class at NCL, most of the students are from catalysis division, which the class which I am teaching these days, NCL. So this question, this actually, as a teacher, I will tell you that you use something called Institute TEM. Actually, in fact, I had organized one meeting, and Dr. Gopinath and I, we are interested in buying TEM sample holder. You know Dr. Gopinath, right, Sayan?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. So Gopi will be here tomorrow to talk to all of you. So I suggested Dr. Gopinath that we buy the sample holder. So to exactly answer your, because catalysis people are interested in knowing in situ the reactions as and when they are being carried out. So in situ TEM is basically you can create that environment of temperature and pressure because a lot of gases are involved. So or in situ XPS, high pressure XPS, you know that, right? Which is there at NCL also. You can do, if you are not aware of, you can check the NCL website. So we have a special XPS which will serve your requirement actually. So you can do in situ. There is one scientist, Vinod Prabhakaran, B. Prabhakaran. So you can contact him, catalysis division. So these two tools I will recommend rather than ellipsometer. So I don't want to oversell ellipsometer to you. Okay, Sam? So I don't want to force ellipsometry measurements for every sample. But because you have asked this question, so I am thinking how we have actually a sample stage where I can control the temperature, liquid nitrogen to around 600 degrees centigrade, and I can control the gas environment. But see, chemistry reactions are more messy, so not necessarily if you're depositing layer by layer and very smooth films in your reactions, then probably ellipsometry will help you. But otherwise, I will not recommend you to do. I won't recommend you because here you are missing the pressure actually. I mean, you need to do the pressure control, right? I'm not sure because modeling will be a hell actually. Yeah. So, any other question? So these are the applications areas which you can probably do. You can carry out, and I think we can end it here. And tomorrow I will take more questions because I am also tired. This is my second lecture, long lecture today. So let us close it here, and then I will we'll meet tomorrow, and we'll look at the analysis actually tomorrow. Okay, some questions we'll take. Yeah, these questions are already answered, but some questions I can see that they are unanswered, especially about the analysis. So I'll take them tomorrow, and tomorrow 11 o'clock. Any other question, guys?
I have a couple of questions, but I think I'll ask them tomorrow. I can wait till then.
Yeah, my throat is actually also trying. Yeah, it has been a long day. Yeah. Okay, so see you tomorrow morning.
Okay, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.